Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast. I'm a slightly hoarse host, Christian Harris, founder of Slip Safety Services. And today we've got a final Sliptember related podcast with a bit of a bonus episode. I was asked by IOSH to do a talk about Sliptember. I do a number of IOSH talks a year, and if you are involved in health and safety in any way, I'd really recommend checking out the IOSH branch meetings wherever you are around the country, or even internationally, in fact, as well as some of their groups. So in October, later this month, for example, I'm going to be speaking for the retail and logistics group, and I think there's already something like 500 people registered for that already. So highly recommend those groups and presentations. So in this webinar, I basically run through setting the scene around slip safety. What are some of the problems? What's the slip problem, the SLP problem that we need to solve around some of the misconceptions that people have? What are some of the solutions that work? We talk about CHIMES, the 6 reasons people slip, break down what that means and look at some of the principles that people need to attack if they want to try to reduce the number of accidents, injuries and claims in this area, and answer some Q&As as well at the end from some of the audience. So I thought this would be a good one to include and tag on at the end of Sliptember, so I hope you enjoy it. Next week on the podcast, we return to our sort of more traditional interviews about the broader themes of safety and risk. And I'm really delighted to be joined by Crystal Danbury of Sainsbury's. She is the group head of safety, risk and insurance. And we have a really good conversation, not really much about Sainsbury's, but actually about some of the thoughts and principles and inspiration that Crystal draws from and go into her backstory as well, which is fascinating. So that's one definitely to look forward to. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy this episode and the final Sliptember themed podcast of 2021. As always, really do thank you for hitting subscribe or follow, for giving us reviews and for sharing the word about the podcast. So let's join the presentation then. There's a tiny bit of preamble and then we get into it. Hope you enjoy it and see you next week for the interview with Crystal Danbury. Cheers.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you.
Hi guys, nice to see you this evening. Thank you for giving up an evening to come and listen to me. So you're gluttons for punishment. I'll just share my slides. So I'm going to be talking to you this evening about slips and falls, which is my kind of key area of specialism. And we've called it Sliptember because, as I'll talk to you a little bit about, I've been running a campaign this month trying to raise awareness of this issue. So this is an interesting part of that, and going to dive into some details and some philosophies and some ideas and thoughts, and hopefully give you plenty to think about and go ahead and implement in your businesses. So if I can get this to work. Yes. So here's the main big idea, which we're going to talk about, the fact that you can stop slips. Now, normally I just stop my presentation here, but because I've been invited and there's so many of you, I will carry on and actually go into a bit more detail. But yeah, this is the big idea. These kinds of accidents, people there's a lot of misperceptions and people just kind of assume that there's nothing that can be done, but there are a lot of things that can be done, and that's what we're going to be exploring in this presentation. It might seem hard because, you know, there are so many of these accidents, but here are a few things to give a bit of cause for comfort potentially. So there are lots of examples of buildings and companies reducing slip and falls by over 50%, both from accidents, but also claims and injuries as well. There's a scientific approach to this. So there is stuff that you can measure and therefore manage. So there's some science behind it, and therefore you can monitor what you're doing. And I'm going to give you a proven roadmap that we know works. So some key principles and some approaches that you can take and implement, and that is going to work because it has worked for many businesses before. So just a little bit about me in terms of background and why you can sort of believe me when I say that it is possible to get such big outcomes and impacts as a 50% plus reduction. So I'm the host of a safety and risk success podcast. Scott, who's on your committee, I've had join me recently. I recommend checking that episode out. My team and I over the years have helped over 5,000 client sites to reduce the risk of slips and falls. So we've got a lot of experience and a lot of data sitting behind some of the philosophies and thinking that we're going to share with you. I personally have worked on some pretty high profile cases. So this poor gentleman here, Stanley May, for example, who slipped over and banged the back of his head in a co-op store in Truro, and sadly passed away. That kind of thing I've been involved in. And the team and I, at last count, we reckon we're sort of preventing around 10 million of slip and fall claims a year, which sounds pretty good. And we're obviously proud of that, but there's still a long way to go. And we, both me personally and the business, partner with various stakeholders, big insurers and brokers and lawyers, and then we work with some blue chip clients like CBRE, do a number of IOSH events and IRSM and things like that as well. And my big goal is to stop a lot of slip and fall accidents. So this is a big American football stadium in Michigan, and there's a lot of people in there, and you might think, well, that's a big goal if we can stop that many accidents. But actually my sites are a bit bigger than that. It's more like this. So my target really is to be stopping 500,000 slips per year around the globe. So that's kind of my big mission that I'm on. And as I mentioned at the start, I'm running this campaign this month called Sliptember, all about raising awareness, challenging some misperceptions, talking about the proven science of what you can do to stop these accidents, and trying to encourage government to be a bit more hands-on in this area as well. So if you'll permit me, just a bit of further background in terms of why I've become really passionate about this subject, because obviously it's a bit of a niche subject to be involved in. But if you cast your mind back to the summer of 2012, in the build-up to the London Olympics, I was actually living in London at the time, in North London, not far away from the Olympic Village, as it happens, sort of in and around Islington. And as before we had kids, so my then girlfriend, now wife, and I on a Sunday would have a sort of lazy day, go to the deli around the corner, grab a croissant, and then sort of plan out what we were going to do for the day. And on this particular Sunday, we decided to go to this place called, what's it called? I've totally forgotten the name. I've had a blank of the name of it. It's a flower market in East London. It'll come to me in a moment. So we went there, we drove there, picked up some flowers, had some food for lunch, and then wanted to pick up some groceries on the way home. So we drove to the Sainsbury's in Islington and parked up our car, locked the door, turned the corner, and started walking down this road here, which is called Tolpuddle Street, towards the store. And the entrance of the store is just around the corner. It's Columbia Road Flower Market, by the way, just around the corner there. And that's the last thing I remember for about 5 or 6 hours, because a car sped around that corner too fast and lost control, mounted the curb, and basically ploughed into me and ran me over. So not the best Sunday afternoon I've ever had. That was me in hospital later that day. You'll notice I've aged a bit. I've got a lot more grey hairs now than I did then, but I probably look a bit better overall now than then, because as you can see, I look a bit spaced out. And you can see there bandages on my collarbone. I broke my collarbone and my wrist and various other things. I always say, it was very unlucky that it happened, but equally I was very lucky that my injuries weren't much worse. So I've suffered an accident that wasn't my fault, pretty serious accident. So I know what it's like, when you're minding your own business and something happens that you weren't expecting, and it knocks you for six and has a really big, profound and long-term impact on your life. And so, that really kind of inspired me to get involved in safety. And whilst you might say, why aren't you in road safety? That would make some sense, I guess, logically. But if you actually look at the statistics and you consider what the biggest cause of accidents, injuries and claims is across the globe, in pretty much every sector, it's slips and falls. So if you want to make an impact in making the world a safer place, this to me seems like a good place to focus on. So moving to that then, I took this photo which made me chuckle one evening in going through a station in London, of all these myriad mats and signs and things all over the floor to try and stop people slipping over. When it comes to slip and falls, we face three big problems, I would suggest, and together they create a slip problem, an SLP problem. There's only three of them, so I had to forego the I, but it's an SLP problem. Let's delve into that and see what you think. So the first thing is, what do I hear when I talk to people and I say I'm in the world of slip and fall prevention? One reaction I get is, well, slips are pretty simple, aren't they? They're straightforward, they're easy, very easy to control. Not much to this, not much depth to this subject. But actually, slips are much more complicated and more complex than people think. So, the typical control measures we see, yellow signs, that's not enough on its own. Spillage control isn't enough on its own. Cleaning records aren't enough on their own. So what we tend to find is people take quite a superficial approach to trying to solve this problem, and therefore we don't achieve the outcome that we want of actually solving the problem. The second thing I kind of hear quite a lot is that slips are low cost. And that could be that, they're just not very expensive, versus another type of claim, for example. Or more often what I hear is, well, it's okay because our insurance company covers the claim anyway, so it doesn't cost us any money, showing a bit of a lack of understanding of how insurance works. But actually, these accidents are much more costly than you might think. So we work with AXA, and they've published on their website that they spend, well, before the pandemic, they were spending £80 million a year on slips. Manual handling was their second biggest cause of safety-related insurance claim at 30 million. So slips was more than twice as big as the next largest cause. And then trips is on top of that as well. That's just solely slips. Now, if you look at AXA's market share, it's well under 10%. So if they're spending 80 million, that suggests that across the whole of the UK, we're spending over £1 billion of claims on slips. We've obviously got the human costs. So we have 300,000 people a year going to A&E after a slip and fall, and that leads to 1.5 million NHS bed days. So think of all of the pressure on the NHS that causes. We've got criminal fine costs. So Tesco was fined £733,000 in early 2020 after one of their customers slipped and broke their hip. And we've also got the hidden uninsured costs. So the good old accident iceberg. And HSE would say, the average hidden cost is 8 to 36 times the claim cost. We did some research of our own, and it was a bit lower than that. We found sort of 10 to 12 times. But whichever way you look at it, if you've got an average claim of £10,000, being paid by your insurer one way or another, that does effectively come out of your bottom line eventually, but you've also got multiples of that coming out of the bottom line. So it's a much more costly problem than people think in all sorts of ways. And the third thing that I hear is that slips are paltry. And by that, I mean insignificant. You know, it's just a slip. Nobody gets really hurt. Doesn't really matter. Perhaps people think it's a bit funny. But that couldn't be further from the truth. You know, these are more serious accidents than people imagine as well. I mentioned Stanley May. We regularly see people suffering life-changing injuries. You know, there was a barber that slipped and stabbed himself. This poor chap, Malcolm White here, who had to have an amputation. There's about a dozen amputations in the UK every year after slips. And then we see people like tennis player here, Eugenie Bouchard, who actually had to withdraw from the US Open after she slipped in the locker room and had a concussion. And interestingly, her tennis career since then has really sort of nosedived. So there may well be some ongoing challenges there. We've seen slips at Wimbledon in the summer, and I was quoted on BBC News about that. Elton John just last week had a fall, which sounds to me like it was probably a slip, and he's had to cancel loads of concerts. So, you know, there are lots and lots of people getting really quite badly hurt as a result of these accidents, and that's why we're having the huge costs as well. So all of those three kind of misconceptions lead to this vicious circle where, you know, we have this mindset challenge, and therefore we don't invest in the skill set to do something better to improve the situation, and therefore we keep having slips and falls being £1 billion a year of claims. We keep having hundreds of thousands of people going to hospital a year, etc. The good news is, though, guys, there is a better way, and that's what we're going to start delving into now. So what I talk a lot about is crossing the bridge from slip to grip. And you'll notice that I try and make this stuff catchy or interesting as much as I can, and so that it tries to resonate with people. But, you know, we're trying to go from where we are now to where we want to be in the future. And this bridge, some of these ideas I'm going to be sharing with you in a moment, are the way to do that. And we know that this works, it's proven, it's backed up with science and lots of case studies. So there's a few T's to think about here. Again, I'm a fan of alliteration. So the first one is tune your chimes. Now, CHIMES is an acronym, and this is the 6 reasons why people slip. So if you have been following any of the Sliptember stuff that I've been doing on LinkedIn, for example, you'll have seen me delving into each of these in quite a lot of depth and giving you an overview of some of the key ideas around them, and then giving you some examples as well. But if you think about this, you know, these are the 6 areas you need to control in order to stop people from slipping over and hurting themselves in your buildings. So let's run through them, and then I'm happy to take some questions on this particular point, because this is quite important. So if anybody does have any questions here, once I've done this run through, then let me know. So the first one is contamination. So if you think about a floor which is clean and dry, then it's very, very unlikely that somebody's going to slip on that floor. So if you can keep your floors clean and dry, in other words, you can prevent or control contamination on the floor surface, then the likelihood of somebody slipping is very, very remote. H is for heel. So clearly, for a slip to occur, someone's heel has to strike a floor, or someone's foot has to strike a floor. So to what extent can we manage the footwear that people are wearing, and what effect can that have on the likelihood of people slipping and falling? This is one where it's much easier to control for members of staff than members of the public, of course, because if you've got a slip issue in a fast food restaurant, you could specify footwear or recommend footwear for your staff in the kitchen, for example, but you can't control what people are wearing on their feet as they enter into the building. I is for individual, so this is all around the human factors. So we can all walk on slippery floors without slipping. Indeed, if that weren't the case, then the numbers I've shared would be significantly higher, because there are a lot of slippery floors out there. So the extent to which we can do that is dependent on, certain things about us. So, our balance, our age, our sex, even as a role as well. But also, are we walking at a normal pace in a straight line, or are we pushing, pulling, twisting, turning? Are we distracted because we're looking at our phone, or there's some noise, or there's some a display in a shop or something like that? So all of these factors can have an effect on, firstly, whether somebody spots a hazard and therefore avoids an accident that way, or secondly, whether perhaps they don't spot the hazard, but we've probably all been there before. You kind of start slipping, but you can stop yourself and self-address before you actually fall. That happens a lot more than actually people falling. Or thirdly, of course, whether somebody could slip, two people could slip in exactly the same place. If it were a 20-year-old lady or girl and an 85-year-old lady, then the likelihood is that 85-year-old lady is going to be much more significantly hurt by the slip and fall than the 20-year-old. Fourth is maintenance. So this splits into three areas, but this is all around how the floor is being looked after over time. So the three things to think about here are change of use. So if you think about let's say supermarkets, and they sometimes move around the stock into different areas of the store. You may well have a certain floor surface in one area because it's designed to be a fishmonger's or something like that. And then that moves to a different part of the store where the floor is different, and therefore you've got a problem. Secondly, there's wear and tear. So think of going to a church and you'll see traffic lines in the floor, over the years, and the stones become weathered, and that's clearly going to have an effect on the slip safety of that surface. And the third one is cleaning, which is really important. So most floors are cleaned regularly, if not daily. But what I see and have experienced over the years is a lot of bad cleaning, a lot of ineffective cleaning, sometimes cleaning that can make floors more slippery rather than less slippery. So getting into the detail of what good cleaning looks like is really important too. E is for environment. So this is all about, yes, the weather. So, Manchester versus Mauritius, how much is it going to rain and how often, for example, but also things like condensation, but also steps and stairs, slopes, lighting, and things like that. And then S, the final one, is surface. So to what extent is the floor slip resistant or anti-slip, if you prefer that word, or not? And if you start life with having a good surface that is sufficiently safe when wet, I'll talk about what that means in a moment, but you don't do very well on the other five CHIMES, you've still got half a chance because you've got a floor that inherently is pretty safe. Whereas on the other hand, if you start life with a floor that's pretty slippery when wet, if you imagine putting a polished marble around a swimming pool, for example, then even if you manage the other five CHIMES really, really well, you've still got that inherent risk because the floor surface itself is slippery. So that's a run through of CHIMES. So these are the 6 areas you need to be thinking about. And I suppose the key question is, which are controllable and when? So we mentioned, heel is more controllable for members of staff than members of the public. Sometimes, you might be a tenant in a building and some of the environmental factors may be less controllable than others. But, some of these are pretty much universally controllable. Others of them are going to be more important in some cases than others. But this is the kind of framework that I recommend you you use to think about this problem in a more holistic and a more detailed and a more in-depth way. When I show this to people, what we tend to see as a reaction is, firstly, wow, I didn't realize there was as much depth to this as you've shown me here, but it does make sense. And then secondly, looking at the model, we're probably only doing one or two of these. And again, going back to what I said about the slip problem, we're looking at this too superficially, and that's why we're not getting a grasp on this. So there's quite a lot of depth there. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody wants to delve into anything about CHIMES now, or if not, happy to wait until the end. But if you did want to ask a question, feel free to do so in the chat, and somebody can. I know the team are monitoring that, and they can always ask the question. But I will carry on. But I'm happy to take questions on that if you want. So the second thing I would suggest that you need to think about is testing your floors. So I mentioned there's some science to this, and this is a key part of that, and it's called slip testing. So this contraption, which I'm going to show you a video of, is called a pendulum slip tester, and it's what is used by the HSE, and it's what's used in the courts in civil claims to measure how slippery or not floor surfaces are. As you'll see when I play the video, it's called a pendulum because it swings, and there's a foot on an arm, and that foot swings down, it strikes the floor between a predetermined distance, and then it swings through, and there's a gauge on the left-hand side of the machine here. Let's just show you it once, and then you get an idea. And this is designed to mimic the physical interaction of a heel striking a floor. So now you've seen that, you can sort of appreciate that, if you think about when you're walking, your heel is striking the floor at 30 odd degrees, you're putting a lot of weight on the floor, and whether the floor is slippery or not is going to determine whether you're likely to slip. I'll just show it to you again, because it is a quick clip. So wetting the floor here, the heel released, it comes down, strikes the floor, and it swings through. And you see there's a pointer on the left-hand side going to a gauge. And that gauge is basically the coefficient of friction of the floor, which is represented in a pendulum test value. The PTV, the pendulum test value, gives you 3 categories of slip potential. So if you score between 0 and 24, you have a high slip potential, 25 to 35 moderate, 36 plus low. And we can take this a stage further as well by correlating the PTV to an accident risk exposure. So if you cast your eyes to the right of the screen here, you can see that if you've got a PTV of 36, you've got a 1 in a million risk exposure. Whereas if you're down on the left-hand side at a PTV of 24, you have a 1 in 20 risk exposure. Now, that doesn't mean that 1 in 20 people will slip. It means that, as I've already said, we can all walk on slippery when wet floors without slipping. But it means that 1 in 20 people is likely to have a potential slip, and they would then need to do something to self-address in order not to slip over. So if you were anything like me, then you'd probably much rather be up in that green zone than down in the red zone, because would I want to be reliant upon 1 in 20 visitors to my building to do something which is outside of my control as the building owner or operator, in order not to have an accident and potentially badly hurt themselves and potentially cost a lot of money in terms of claims, or would I rather be reliant on only 1 in a million? Well, I think if it were me, I know where I would want to be. And so basically what my team and I do, therefore, is we help people to, through the testing, understand where they sit on this scale, and then try to move people as far up that scale as we can. So if we're finding anyone in that red zone and it's in an area of a building that is likely to get wet or contaminated, what can we do to get them into the green zone? And when it comes to testing floors, there are two main benefits. One is, we're reducing the likelihood of an accident happening in the first place. But the other, as mentioned here by David Scott from CHIMES, who is a partner in CHIMES, which is a solicitor's firm that defends insurance claims. If you've got compliant slip test data, you should expect to defend that claim. So in other words, your duty, as you guys will know, is not to prevent every accident. It's not to have zero risk. It's to take reasonable and practicable steps. If, in the context of slips, you get the slip testing done, and David, myself, the insurers that we work with, various other people would recommend that should be done probably annually, so that it's current. But this particular quote was referring to a poolside, and his view was, just because someone slips on a poolside, that doesn't mean they're entitled to make a claim, because if the client can prove that they've taken the correct steps, that they've done their due diligence, they've been proactive, they've measured this correctly, and they've got that test certificate which shows that within 12 months of an accident, they've done all those things and the floor was safe when wet. His view and his experience is that you should therefore expect to be able to defend any claims that do arise. The next T is trusting the process. So this is our 6-step method that we suggest people go through and what we work through with clients. So measuring is the first thing we need to do. That's both doing the slip testing, but also measuring things like how effective the cleanliness is, measuring the slip resistance of the footwear, measuring slopes and tangents of ramps and things like that. That drives understanding. We then use that CHIMES framework to really delve into, where we're weak, where we're strong, where we can improve. Then it's about improving the situation, maintaining and monitoring that. And then lastly, producing evidence so that we can prove what we're doing, prove that we've taken those reasonable steps, and be in a position to not just reduce accidents, but also be able to defend more claims as well. And lastly, I'd say take the scorecard. So we've developed this tool called the Slip Safety Scorecard, which is a digital self-assessment. And it's totally free to use. It takes 5 minutes to do. Basically, you answer some yes/no questions, and then at the end of that, you get a 30-page report, including all of your scores, and you get a score for each of the areas of CHIMES, so you can start to see where you're strongest and where you've got most room for improvement. It then gives you tips and recommendations, again, based on your score, as to where you can improve and what you could do in each of those areas to try to get a better overall result. And for everyone that takes that, they've got the opportunity to book in a Zoom with me for 15 minutes. And actually we can delve into the detail of the scores, look at where you've scored and how you've scored and why, and then start to put in place a bit of a plan to try to improve the scores and lower risk. So that's a really good resource, which is free to use, and I'd certainly recommend. So with all that said, then that's the kind of the why and the how. What's this going to lead to? So I said, that we've got lots of examples of at least a 50% reduction of accidents and claims, and here are a few examples from some different sectors, from swimming pools to restaurants to shopping centres and train stations and everything in between. So we've got loads of examples like this where clients have worked through this process. We've helped them as parts of it, but they've done a lot of work on their own as well, of course, because we're not miracle workers, A, and B, we're not there every second of the day. But you can see, very significant improvements. And straight away, this can happen, because if you get this stuff right, your reduction in risk happens there and then. And so, you can go to bed at night and know that, that next day, the chance of someone slipping, falling and hurting themselves is much, much lower than it was the day before. The next kind of outcome, which is a slightly longer term thing, is to think about some of the insurable risk benefits to this. So I did a podcast interview with Chris Gill, who he's as you can see there, he's much less handsome than me. No, great guy, good friend of mine in the industry, and annoyingly handsome man. But he has worked both for insurers, brokers. He's been a risk manager, so he's kind of got this full spectrum understanding. And we talked about the hidden secrets of insurer risk management bursaries, and how insurance companies will fund this kind of work, particularly in this area of slips and falls, because it is their biggest cause of loss, and therefore they want to try to reduce those claims, reduce those losses. So something that I'd certainly recommend is having a conversation with your insurer about part funding some of this kind of work. But also, again, we've got lots of examples of where premiums have fallen quite sharply just by getting slip testing done, for example, because you're showing your insurer that you're taking it seriously, that you're a good risk in their terms, and therefore, they feel more comfortable insuring you for a lower price. And then in the longer term, I talk about the 4 Ps, which is all around. It's a kind of step-by-step thing, but it's all around if you can get this right. The first people that will notice will be your team, and there's so much evidence to show that a team feeling safe and feeling protected is really, really important, and you get lots of benefits from that, including high performance. And obviously, if you've got a high performing team, you're going to be driving more profit in the business, which all businesses are in the business of achieving. And if you can get a high performing team that feels safe and they're driving a lot of profit, that gives the business the power to do some really interesting and meaningful things. That could be expansion, it could be developing new products, it could be charitable and social impact. But if you can sort of go through this hierarchy and achieve those goals by taking a more proactive approach and driving down this big area of risk, then the rewards in the long run can be significant. I don't know if you've seen, you probably have the Alcoa example, where over a 15-year period they increased their profitability by a multiple of 7 times, I think it was, and they were a big company before, and they were even bigger company at the end of that, with a relentless and a singular focus on safety. So if those kind of outcomes sound interesting to you, what would I suggest? I would suggest taking the scorecard. I would suggest then booking in a Zoom with me and having a chat. And I'm giving away a lot of free slip tests this month for Sliptember, just again to try and raise awareness. So I'm very happy from everybody that attends this. Anybody that books a call, does the scorecard, books a call, I'll put you into a hat and do a draw, and I'll give away 5 free slip tests. So we'll come out to your site, do the testing for you, and look in detail at some of the stuff that's happening in the real world on your floors and in your buildings. So that's pretty much the end in terms of the content. I'm doing well on time, which is a bonus. All I would say to kind of sum up, and hopefully this has come through, is that I suppose what I'm really known for, and hopefully this has come out, and I'm sure it's shared by all of you guys because of what you do, is being really passionate and really caring about a subject that not many people want to talk about quite often, which is making people feel safer. And as I said before, this is the biggest area of people having a health and safety issue. And so for me, it's really important that we focus on this and we give it the care and the attention that it deserves. but that sadly has been and still is unfortunately lacking in many ways. What does that look like? I mean, for me, it's about you guys as health and safety leaders feeling secure and feeling like you're feeling safe because you have gone that extra mile and really understood this important topic in more detail, and hopefully I've helped you to achieve some of that this evening, and obviously some of the resources will help you to achieve that over time as well. But then being able to pass that feeling of safety on to your colleagues, to your team, because they can, if we take some of these steps and make some of these improvements, they'll be the ones on the front line seeing it, as will your customers and your supply chain and so on. So, for me, this is what this is all about. I've got this big goal of trying to reduce these accidents by 500,000, but it's getting that feeling of safety is really important to me. So thanks very much for joining this evening. I see there's been a few questions. Happy to take as many questions as we have. Really interested to know what you found most useful, what you found most valuable, what you found most surprising, perhaps. My details are there, and do remember to give the scorecard a go. If you just Google it, you'll find it, or you can go to slipsafety.co.uk/scorecard. We can then have a chat and see if you can win a free slip test as well. So thanks very much, guys.
Great, thank you very much, Christian. Very thought-provoking, definitely, and some very useful tools there to go away with, and particularly that invitation to work with yourself, and the tools that you have there as well. So really fascinating. Yes, a new light dawned on slips and trips, definitely, for me. So yes, as you say, there are some questions there. I'm just going to pop to gallery view there. There are some comments, really. One's from Karen, and interested to see the CHIMES model, as you can see there, but I'm not sure how many we could use in a mobile food stall at a festival when it's raining. They've got someone to come and measure a hair salon as well, and polish tiles. When they opened, they were surprised, and that was polished tiles and cut hair were a slippery combination. So there was a bit of sort of confusion there. So have you anything to those comments?
Yes, so on the second one, yeah, I mean, why would you be surprised that polished tiles and cut hair were a slippery combination? Because what people get fixated on is obviously wet floors, but it doesn't matter what the contaminant is. It could be dust, it could be hair, it could be semi-solids, it could be grease, it could be body fats, it could be anything that produces a barrier between the floor and the heel. Is a contaminant, and that's what we kind of need to manage. And if you've got the wrong contaminant on the wrong floor, like you've got there, you've got something that is going to cause a slip risk. So yeah, absolutely be aware of all contamination.
That was a new hair salon that had opened when I was in the HO, new hair salon. So went in to do an inspection, and they had the most beautiful polished tiles because it looked lovely. So it was all about, visual perception of the customers and everything. And they were really surprised. And we had to call in the HSE, who did got somebody to come and do a pendulum test physically to show them that there was an issue, even though we all could clearly see it was, but they were like, no, we've spent all this money on the tiles and we're going to have to take them up and all of this. They said, yes, but going to cost you a lot more. But it was talking about things like putting a mat in the doorway so that when the ladies came in with their long coats dripping with water and their umbrellas and things, and an umbrella stand, so that they could minimize what they were doing, as well as trying to prevent the hair and everything else on the floor. So yeah,
absolutely. I mean, one of the big challenges is that people will often misunderstand what is a dry and what versus a wet or contaminated environment. So the architect or whoever chose those tiles probably thought, well, this is a dry environment because it's not going to get wet, and therefore they didn't think about the wet or contaminated, slip safety of the floor. But it wasn't until the real world intervened that they realised that actually that is a problem. And one of the big issues that I see a lot is around building entrances. So you've kind of alluded to it there. People have this kind of assumption that, oh, we've got matting, so therefore our reception is a dry area. It's not a wet area. But actually, if you look at the guidance by the HSE and the Entrance Flooring Association, they say that if you've got a peak traffic rate of 800 people per hour coming through that entrance, you should have built-in matting of 8 to 10 meters. So think about how many buildings you've ever been to with 8 to 10 meters of matting. Most buildings have like a meter if they're lucky. So what you find a lot of issues on these receptions where people kind of think, oh, we've got matting, so we're okay. Then they put the wrong floor in, or they don't maintain the floor properly, or whatever it might be. And that's when accidents can happen. In terms of the mobile food stall, I would argue that many of the chimes you could think about, some of them maybe not, but individual, for example, what could we do to minimize people needing to push, pull, twist, turn, carry? Heel, could we provide slip resistant shoes for people to wear, as in members of staff? Environment,
it'd be wellies at a wet festival.
Yeah. But environment, could we check that lighting is sufficient? Could we try to check that surfaces are flat rather than sloped? So actually, if you start looking at it, there are lots of things that cleaning and maintenance. Can we make sure we've effectively cleaned the surface so that it doesn't just look clean in inverted commas, but it's actually clean, and therefore we're not introducing more of a problem by leaving residues behind. So I'm not saying it's a foolproof system, but I think actually in most cases, and remember, you can't necessarily control all of these. Many cases you can only control one or two. In that case, you need to go all in on those one or two. Ideally, you look at all six. And I always suggest looking at chimes like a multiplication table. So don't think of it as 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. Look at it as 2 out of 10 or whatever. Look at it as 7 times 7 times 7, and multiply the effect. So in other words, if you get a holistic view, you increase the scores around that circle, you're going to see much better results than if you do well on one or two and neglect the others.
With the festival food, it's really interesting because as a food safety inspector, you're also looking at health and safety risks. A typical flooring for a food festival when it's wet is cardboard. And they've got deep fat fryers and all sorts of things around, which is horrendous. But as an inspector, if you're going across festival fields that are kind of knee deep in mud, you're also bringing in contamination, and that's you're thinking, well, I've got food safety because it could affect all of the customers, but then I've also got health and safety that could affect the 4 or 5 staff that are in there. So, and I'm not talking about big food stalls at all. These are chip vans and things like that. So it's a real struggle, but you have to just minimize. You're right, you've got to try and minimize the risks as much as you can.
Yeah, I mean, in that sort of environment, I would probably be thinking about footwear as being the best possible measure for the staff, because actually if you've got really good footwear, and I would use there's a HSE testing method called GRIP for footwear, which I'd recommend people use. You can walk on very, very slippery surfaces indeed, even covered with oil, and still be safe if you've got the footwear right. So that, to me, the cost of providing good footwear is pretty insignificant, certainly versus the cost of somebody slipping and putting their hand into a deep fat fryer.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Thank you then, Karen. There's Colin Parker has put in, hi, we struggle with transition areas coming from a freezer -50 to ambient. What sort of comments have you there, Christian?
Yeah, so that is a common thing. That's something where I would suggest, again, thinking about footwear and thinking about the surface from the perspective of, is there a way of having a different type of surface that might be less susceptible to the liquid building up and causing a problem. So, if you think about quite often in industrial settings, you see kind of you definitely don't want checker plating because that's very slippery. But you sometimes see like metal mesh almost, or grills, where you've kind of got very thin metal strips, but they have holes in which give you the grip and the traction within the foot, but it allows the contamination to fall away. So something like that. But there are other sort of mats and things as well that you could consider. But yeah, that's one where you can't really control the contamination again, so we've got to rule that one out. So we're thinking about some of the human factors, training, making people take more care. Can we avoid people having to be carrying too much or being distracted? Can we do anything footwear, surface, etc.?
Okay, great.
Thank you, mate.
Right.
We're looking at GRP grating at the moment in the freezer, and then that coming out of it, we may just have a walk area so they can then change the boots.
Yeah, and then, if you want to drop me a line or give us a call, I'll happily have a look at it.
Okay,
throw some ideas around with you. I'm working on something with a construction company at the moment around like temporary nosings for building site, massive building site. But I mean, I don't make or sell nosings. I'm not going to get anything out of it. But again, I'm I want to solve these problems. So always happy to have a look.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you, Colin. Clive, did you want to mention your question there? Go through it.
Yeah, it's basically extending on from your discussion with Karen, Christian, which was about designing floors to be non-slip. I probably can recount 10 or 12 examples where we've had floors replaced or we've had new buildings, and basically the architect, the designer, has not considered slip strips and falls at all. All they've gone for is look.
Yeah.
And that's created huge problems. I remember one terrazzo floor, we spent, I don't know, countless thousands looking for a solution to actually put something on terrazzo which made it non-slip but actually kept the look.
Yeah.
So I just wondered whether or not with the new building safety legislation coming online, possibly more responsibility placed on the whole life of the building, whether or not we need to consider what we're going to do with architects and designers, and whether or not we need to approach them directly, or whether or not the legislation is going to be sufficient.
Yeah, good question. So I'll pick out a few points from that. Terrazzo, there are now some ways of achieving a good balance between aesthetic and safety. So one of those case studies I shared was the Brunswick Shopping Centre in Scarborough, which is a lovely terrazzo floor, and they've got a big ramp just inside the main entrance of the building, and they were having quite a few issues there. And we got involved in that, and we came up with a solution that made that meant that they actually didn't have a single accident for 12 or 13 months after we initially did that. So technology has moved on quite a fair bit in this space over the last, even in the last couple of years, to be honest. In terms of architects, so I would say that you're right that, again, it's a bit like what I was saying with Karen, that people sometimes don't understand the difference between a dry and a wet sort of environment, and architects are often guilty of that. I would say that they are better now than they were, because there's more understanding of, pendulum testing and things like that, that certainly than there was 10 years ago. Sometimes we're actually seeing people going overboard now. So the architects, some of them are getting incredibly conservative and worried about being sued or whatever. And so they're kind of over specifying super grippy surfaces, which is actually causing in many ways more problems than not. But I interviewed an architect on the podcast recently who does a lot of sort of leisure, and he's done theatres and so on. And we had a good chat about safety and design. So if that's a topic of interest, you might want to check that one out. But I do think that is something that we still need to continue working on. And then in terms of the building safety legislation, as I understand it, there is a bit in there about sort of, I think it's mostly about like exit routes from buildings in terms of emergencies and making sure that slips and falls are thought about and stuff. So I think that will help, hopefully. I do think that there is a challenge around, and we talked about this on the podcast with Graham, the architect, around kind of the building gets built, and even if the architect's got a vision for how it's maintained, what tends to happen is people have their own ideas of how they want to maintain and look after these buildings, and they might outsource that to a third party, or they might hire in a cleaning company or whatever it might be, and then they do their own thing. And so what you end up happening a lot of the time is that the vision and the processes that the architect often did think about and did put in place are just sitting on a dusty shelf somewhere, untouched and never looked at. So there's definitely an opportunity there to improve engagement with the architectural community, get them more involved in thinking about the operations. But then there's an important piece at the end of kind of joining up the thinking that they've done and the work that they've put in to try and design this building for its full life cycle, and what actually happens on the ground in the real world at night, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of issues there. Some of the floors that you've seen where there have been issues before, obviously I wasn't involved in them, or not that I'm aware of, but I would bet, if I were a betting man, and I have played a bit of poker back in the day, that actually some of those issues were probably not necessarily the floor, but they may well have been caused by some of these kind of ongoing, post handover things like cleaning. Because whilst you would expect, for example, that if you outsource your cleaning to a cleaning company, they know how to clean, the reality is that when it comes to cleaning for safety, they don't really know what they're doing. And so quite often they're cleaning these floors. They look good, but they need to be performing well or good. Good to say look good and perform good, even though it's not good English. So yeah, there's some issues there as well.
Okay, Clive.
Yes, thank you. I think the other thing that probably needs to be considered as well is the requirements for people with partial sight or other disabilities, and that wasn't such a big issue, say even 20 years ago. So when you've got old buildings, you really are up against it.
It's like in the NHS, there's a lot of work going on with replacing of floors or sort of recolouring and things like that, because you've got these kind of very shiny neutral coloured lino or vinyl floors, but those are no good from a dementia sort of block colour perspective. So there's an opportunity there to look at the safety from a slip and trip perspective, as well as that aspect of things as well, I would say.
Okay, right. I think that's it. There's no more questions now. So I can say thank you very much, Christian, and everyone would normally clap hands and say, great. And so, but we do really appreciate your time, Christian. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.